communities with toxic waste. Stone sneers at her arguments, shuts down her objections, and commands the room with the smugness of a man who thinks he's untouchable. Until just minutes later, Crockett detonates the courtroom with a chain of evidence so explosive, it doesn't just silence the room, it rips through the nation's illusion of justice. When the man behind the gavel becomes the one on trial, what's left of the system we're told to trust? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The air inside courtroom 7A didn't just hum, it vibrated with anticipation, like the seconds before a lightning strike. Cameras were forbidden, but that didn't stop the swarm of reporters scribbling furiously, their pens clicking like weapons being cocked. The gallery was standing room only. Legal scholars, activists, retired judges, Wall Street executives, all waiting to see how far this would go. At the heart of it all was a case that had fractured public trust. United States versus Harrington Dynamics, a $14 billion conglomerate accused of laundering campaign donations, burying toxic waste beneath minority neighborhoods, and bribing local officials into silence. It wasn't just a corporate scandal, it was an indictment of a system many believed had long sold out to the highest bidder. And presiding over it was Judge Andrew H. Stone, the iron-jawed, black-robed titan of federal law, infamous for his ruthless cross-examinations and his disdain for what he called emotional theatrics. He entered the chamber like a Roman general to a Colosseum, robe flowing, chin lifted, his presence alone shrinking the oxygen in the room. He had built a reputation not just as a judge, but as a political gatekeeper, tough on grandstanding, merciless toward lawyers who didn't know their place, which made his matchup today with Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett more than a legal battle. It was a powder keg. Crockett didn't flinch. She rose from the prosecution's table with the steady calm of someone long used to being underestimated and paying the price for it. Her navy suit caught the courtroom lights, but it was her eyes, sharp, focused, unshakable, that held the room. She hadn't left the halls of Congress for publicity. She came for accountability. Harrington's elite legal team, gray-haired, overpaid and smug, muttered as she stood. Some sneered. Others laughed under their breath. She didn't care. She was here for the poisoned families, the silenced whistleblowers. The truth buried under non-disclosure agreements and campaign checks. Judge Stone had a history. He ruled for corporations nearly 3 out of 4 times. But Crockett wasn't here to play the odds. She was here to crack them wide open. She had barely uttered the phrase "new financial evidence" when the shift came, subtle at first, like the tightening of a bowstring before the arrow flies. Judge Andrew Stone leaned back in his towering leather chair, the overhead lights casting hard shadows across his face, giving his smirk the look of something carved from granite. With deliberate slowness, he slid his reading glasses down his nose, not to see better, but to see her worse. "Tell me, Congresswoman," he began, voice smooth as oil but lined with blades. "Are we still in federal court, or did I stumble onto a casting call for law and order?" The courtroom didn't erupt. It winced. A few uneasy chuckles surfaced, mostly from the defense table, but even those were thin and hollow, like glass tapping against a tombstone. Jasmine Crockett didn't move. Her fingers rested lightly on the edge of the evidence binder, still unopened. Her gaze didn't waver, didn't blink. But beneath the surface, under the composed breath, behind the unshaken shoulders, was the familiar sensation of institutional condescension, tightening around her throat like an invisible collar. She had been here before. Not this courtroom, not this judge, but this exact moment. The moment where truth meets the wall of power and power laughs. The moment when a woman of color, armed with facts and fire, is told implicitly or explicitly that her presence is an inconvenience to the traditions of power. Judge Stone wasn't questioning her evidence. He was questioning her right to introduce it, to possess it, to even stand there. Still seated, Stone let out a theatrical sigh and tapped the bench twice. "So let me get this straight," he said, voice rising just enough to ensure the entire gallery heard every syllable. "After 2 years of investigation, a sealed indictment, a full trial calendar, and extensive pretrial motions, you've suddenly, miraculously, stumbled upon offshore accounts He arched an eyebrow as if speaking to a misbehaving student, not a sitting member of Congress and federal prosecutor. What's next? A smoking gun mailed to your hotel room? A confession written on the back of a cocktail napkin? More laughter from the defense team, the kind of cruel amusement that didn't come from humor, but dominance. Crockett inhaled slowly through her nose, not as a pause, but as a quiet refusal to let rage take the wheel. Her mind calculated the damage, the optics, the trap being set before her. This wasn't about one piece of evidence. It was about control. It was about erasing her authority with a shrug and a joke. And worse, it was working. The judge had the room. The stenographer hesitated at her keys. Jurors looked confused. Even reporters, those wolves of spectacle, leaned back in their chairs, unsure whether to take this seriously. And yet, Crockett stayed still, calm, precise. "Your Honor," she began, voice low but cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "This isn't television, and I'm not here for applause." She reached forward, opened the binder, and lifted the first page. Wire transfer logs linking Harrington Dynamics to a shell corporation in Belize, dated just 3 weeks prior. This is admissible under Rule 26 as supplemental discovery obtained under a judicially approved warrant. Its relevance is immediate, and its origin is lawful. No tremble in her tone, no plea in her words. Just the cold edge of a woman who had prepared not just for this trial, but for this very humiliation. But the injustice hung in the air like poison gas. Judge Stone had not just attacked the motion, he had attacked her. Publicly, deliberately, in front of a courtroom that watched it happen in real time and said nothing. And Jasmine Crockett, alone behind her desk of papers and truth, stood as the only one willing to say, "This will not be ignored." The gavel had not yet struck, but the fight had already begun. The moment Jasmine Crockett began citing the first offshore transaction, the temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop. "This transfer," she stated, lifting a page from the binder, "was executed 3 days before a regulatory exemption was granted to Harrington Dynamics. One signed off without public notice." Her voice was measured, legal language precise. "It was routed through a Cayman-based entity later identified by Treasury analysts as a Harrington-controlled asset." The courtroom was silent, attentive. But before she could proceed to the second transaction, Judge Stone raised a hand, sharp, impatient. "That's enough," he snapped, without even glancing at the document. "We're not going to derail these proceedings with speculative treasure maps and offshore fairy tales." His tone wasn't one of neutral arbitration. It was accusatory, almost disdainful. Crockett attempted to clarify. "Your Honor, these records were obtained through valid warrants and fall within the court's evidentiary scope under—" But Stone cut in again. "Spare me the citations, Miss Crockett. This court isn't here to entertain a last-minute rescue mission for a weak case." He didn't overrule with reason. He dismissed with contempt. Then, with a calculated pause, Stone leaned forward and added, "Tell me, is this how your office handled the Westover case?" The name hit the room like a dropped gavel. Crockett remained composed, but she understood exactly what he was doing. Westover had been a publicly embarrassing prosecution 2 years prior, poorly managed, poorly vetted, and ultimately dismissed. It had nothing to do with her. "Because from where I sit," Stone continued, "this feels like the same pattern all over again. Rushed evidence, shifting targets, procedural desperation." His words were deliberate, his voice low but cutting. It wasn't a legal argument. It was a public indictment of her professionalism. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't raise her voice or bristle with emotion. "For the record, Your Honor," she said, steady and unshaken, "the Westover prosecution was led by a separate office under separate supervision. I had no role in that matter. The evidence before this court today was obtained through judicially authorized subpoenas and has been properly disclosed under Rule 26. She didn't defend herself. She defended the law. Her restraint was not passivity. It was tactical precision in the face of an attack meant to delegitimize her authority. And though the judge's words had drawn blood, she made sure the courtroom heard something louder. She would not be broken by them. And yet, through every interruption, every public slight, every false connection drawn to cases she had never touched, Jasmine Crockett stood unmoved. But stillness did not mean surrender. It meant control. Her silence was not compliance. It was the loading of a weapon, one carefully built not from emotion, but from fact. She had asked for a sidebar, a simple procedural request to address what was fast becoming judicial misconduct. It was denied without a moment's thought, waved off with a smirk, as if transparency meant humiliation for her alone. Stone didn't want a private conversation. He wanted a spectacle, a courtroom where his authority reigned unchecked and unquestioned. And in doing so, he left her only one option: to strike back not with fury, but with precision. What happened next wasn't improvisation. It was the unveiling of a contingency she had prepared for long before she ever stepped foot into courtroom 7A. Crockett adjusted her posture, not defensive, but deliberate. Her voice didn't rise, but it hardened into steel. "Your Honor," she began, each word paced with the rhythm of a final warning. "Due to the escalating pattern of judicial hostility, your repeated rejection of admissible evidence without proper review, and your personal references to unrelated cases, the prosecution formally moves for your recusal from these proceedings on the grounds of demonstrated bias and undisclosed conflicts of interest." The sentence didn't need theatrical flair. Its weight did the talking. The gallery fell into absolute stillness. No coughs, no scribbling pens, not even the rustle of suits shifting in leather chairs. On the defense side, an attorney's expression collapsed into blank disbelief. Stone blinked once but said nothing. His hand, which had spent the last hour gesturing with impunity, now curled slightly against the edge of the bench. And then, without a single wasted motion, Crockett nodded to her lead aide. A sealed blue binder was passed into the hands of the courtroom bailiff, thick enough to make the wood beneath it creak. The courtroom watched it travel toward the bench like a slow-moving verdict. The label read simply, "Motion to recuse, Exhibits A through H." The moment the file touched the judge's desk, something shifted, not in volume, but in gravity. The performance had ended. What followed would not be spectacle. It would be record. For the first time that morning, the courtroom belonged not to the robe, but to the facts. And the person delivering them had just claimed the floor, not by force, but by truth. The moment Judge Stone cracked open the blue binder, a visible tension spread across his jawline. A flicker of recognition, of dread, or both. He scanned the first document without lifting his head, but everyone in the courtroom saw the shift in his expression. His fingers, so confident on the bench minutes earlier, now hesitated over the pages. Inside were detailed records of 17 financial transactions, each traceable, time-stamped, and linked to Meridian Strategies LLC, a company legally owned by his brother-in-law, but functionally operated as a financial proxy. The recipients of those payments? A web of subsidiaries under Harrington Dynamics, the very defendant in this federal trial. Jasmine Crockett had not submitted vague claims or unverified leads. These were official wire logs reviewed by forensic accountants, and each transaction coincided, down to the week, with Stone's rulings in past Harrington-related cases. Rulings that had suppressed subpoenas, sealed testimonies, and once even dismissed an EPA complaint without full hearing. The implication wasn't circumstantial. It was systematic. But it wasn't just the money. It was the motive. Attached behind the transaction summary were 3 sworn affidavits, each from former clerks who had served under Stone. Each account was deeply personal, uncomfortably specific. One clerk, whose initials were redacted, but whose affidavit was notarized and authenticated, recalled Stone muttering after a 2020 regulatory hearing, "Crockett again? I've had enough of her righteous nonsense since that coastal petroleum mess. She wants to turn every case into a racial crusade." Another affidavit cited a moment during Chambers' review where Stone allegedly said, "She's not here for justice. She's here for attention. I don't trust anything with her name on it." The third was the most damning, recounting a conversation where Stone referred to Crockett as a political liability in a suit and vowed she'd never win a case in his courtroom. These weren't anonymous tips. They were declarations signed under penalty of perjury, accompanied by internal calendar logs and location records that aligned with each incident. Crockett waited for no reaction. Her voice came in low, unwavering. "These exhibits, along with a full memorandum, were submitted at 8:47 a.m. this morning to the Judicial Ethics Review Committee and concurrently to the Department of Justice's Public Integrity Division, she said. They are now part of active review. She didn't need to raise her voice. The weight of the words did all the lifting. In a courtroom built to amplify power, she had just inverted the balance. Without shouting, without pleading, and without ever stepping outside the law. And now with the binder lying open on his bench, its contents laid bare for all to see, Judge Andrew H. Stone was no longer the one doing the judging. The weight of the binder still hung over the courtroom like a thundercloud, thick with implications, when a sudden shift in energy pulled every gaze toward the side entrance. The door opened, not dramatically, but with a quiet urgency that cut deeper than any shout. A court clerk entered, her pace quick, face pale, both hands clutched tightly around a large sealed envelope bearing the gold insignia of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. No one dared speak. Even Judge Stone seemed momentarily caught off guard. She crossed the floor with precision, each footstep echoing against the marble as if marking the seconds before impact. When she reached the bench, her words were measured but heavy. Emergency directive from the appellate court, delivered by secure dispatch. Time sensitive. She handed it directly to the judge, her fingertips releasing the envelope only when he reluctantly accepted it. Stone's hands, once unwavering in their command of the courtroom, now betrayed him. The tremor in his grip was unmistakable. His thumb hesitated at the wax seal, as though some part of him already knew what lay inside. And then, he opened it. The first sentence struck like a blade. All proceedings under docket number 2, 914-F, are hereby ordered paused, effective immediately, pending review of judicial recusal request and potential conflicts of interest. The courtroom didn't gasp. It didn't need to. The silence itself became the reaction, a silence so dense it seemed to press against the walls. A bailiff lowered his eyes. A juror's pen slipped from her hand. The courtroom reporter, who had typed through hours of crossfire, now sat motionless, fingers hovering above her machine, like they'd lost their purpose. Judge Stone didn't speak. He just stared at the page, jaw clenched, the paper slowly crumpling where his grip had tightened unconsciously. The authority that had animated every word he uttered that morning now drained from his frame. His face, once flushed with dominance, turned a cold, uneven gray. Behind the bench, the great seal of the court loomed above him like a reminder, not of power, but of accountability. And across the room, Jasmine Crockett didn't move. Her stillness wasn't shock. It was readiness. The room had waited for his reaction, but now it was reacting to hers. Without raising her voice, without rising from her seat, she had forced the entire machinery of federal authority to confront itself. The trial had been paused, but something far greater had just begun. The air inside courtroom 7A had become almost unbreathable, thick with suspicion, frozen in disbelief. The appellate court's emergency stay still sat in Judge Stone's hands, its language cold and unforgiving, yet he hadn't spoken since opening it. His lips remained parted. His eyes, once sharp with control, now stared blankly at the middle distance. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished, not by a mile. If what had come before was structure, now came the collapse. She reached deliberately into her binder and pulled out 2 folders, both thicker than the last, both marked with crisp white labels. Exhibit G and Exhibit H. The prosecution table, until now a fortress of quiet endurance, became the center of gravity in the room. Your Honor, she began, voice unwavering, these final submissions pertain directly to rulings previously issued by this court. Rulings that, based on newly uncovered evidence, appear compromised by financial entanglement. Her hand rested on Exhibit G as she spoke. Within this file are bank records, 5 distinct wire transfers sent from Harrington Dynamics to Caribbean Holdings LLC, an offshore entity domiciled in the British Virgin Islands. The transfers were routed through layered intermediaries, but forensic tracing links them all back to Meridian Strategies, the same shell firm associated with your brother-in-law. A collective shift rustled through the gallery, subtle, instinctive. Even the defense table, usually smug with confidence, had fallen unnervingly quiet. These 5 transfers, she continued, lifting the top document, without removing it from the folder, were executed just days within 72 hours before 5 key rulings issued by this court in favor of Harrington Dynamics over the past 31 months. In each instance, those rulings shielded the defendant from regulatory scrutiny, suppressed critical subpoenas, or dismissed whistleblower testimony outright. She looked directly at Stone now. Her voice remained controlled, but each word struck like a bell tolling over marble. Your rulings, Your Honor, coincided with payments. She didn't say bribe. She didn't need to. The numbers said it for her. Then came the second folder, Exhibit H. She placed it carefully on top of the first but didn't open it. Not yet. This exhibit, she announced, includes a certified audio recording and its corresponding transcript. Her tone darkened, not louder but deeper. It was captured at a private dinner at the Cypress Club less than 4 weeks ago. Present at that dinner, Mr. Charles Harrington, CEO of the defendant corporation, and Your Honor, yourself. No one moved. Jasmine continued. In the course of that conversation, recorded legally by a third-party witness seated nearby, you made the following statement: Crockett will never make it to a jury. There was no outburst, no gasp, just stillness, hard, irreversible, because now it was personal, not procedural, not circumstantial. A federal judge had been caught on tape undermining a prosecutor by name, suggesting the outcome of a case hadn't merely been predicted. It had already been decided. Judge Stone's face turned a shade paler, and his mouth pressed into a hard line. The paper from the appellate court, still in his hand, began to curl slightly from the pressure of his grip. The illusion of control, once total, was now visibly unraveling. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, movement. At the back of the courtroom, 3 men stood up in unison. No flash, no badge held aloft. But they didn't need introductions. Their posture was unmistakable. Broad stance, clean suits, no papers in their hands, no laptops or notepads in front of them. One wore a dark tie with a muted federal insignia. Another had a credentials lanyard half tucked into his jacket. All eyes turned toward them instinctively, like iron pulled toward a magnet. They weren't observers. They were federal agents, FBI, Public Corruption Division. They did not speak. They did not approach. They simply stood, watching, still, alert, not to intervene, not yet, but to bear witness to what came next. And though the judge sat in the tallest chair, and though the defense team was lined with Ivy League pedigree, and though the courtroom still carried his name on the docket, everyone in that room understood. The balance of power had shifted, and Jasmine Crockett was the one who moved it. And as the tension rippled outward from the standing FBI agents like a fault line preparing to rupture, Jasmine Crockett remained a pillar of poised certainty. She reached into her case folder, unshaken, deliberate, and retrieved a sealed federal envelope. Without flair or flourish, she extended it to the lead agent. Her words were steady, razor clear. This is a federal arrest warrant for Judge Andrew H. Stone, signed at 7:52 a.m. this morning by Judge Elena M. Hernandez of the Southern District. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every syllable carried the weight of constitutional authority, and the courtroom knew it. The agent gave a small nod, tucked the envelope into his coat, and turned toward the judge's private chambers. The room seemed to shrink as he walked. He reached the door, knocked twice, firmly, officially. Judge Stone, federal agents, we need you to come out immediately. We have a judicial warrant issued for your detainment. The silence behind the door was sharp, artificial, like a man thinking through 1,000 outcomes and not liking any of them. Another knock, louder now. Judge, this is not a request. Open the door. Nothing. No footsteps, no voice. Just that awful stillness, thick and deliberate. The agent exchanged a glance with his partner. One reached into his inner pocket, produced a bypass tool, and slid it into the lock. The mechanism gave way with a muted click. Then they disappeared inside. Every person in the courtroom sat frozen, not by force, but by awe. It was the kind of stillness usually reserved for final verdicts, funerals, or historical broadcasts. Seconds passed. Then the door opened again, And what emerged was not the same man who had entered it just an hour earlier. Judge Stone appeared, flanked on either side by federal officers. His shoulders were drawn in tight, his face rigid, eyes fixed downward. His blazer, once immaculate, now clung unevenly to his frame, as if it no longer recognized its wearer. Where once he had held the room with theatrical scorn, now he moved with the awkwardness of a man caught between two collapsing worlds, his authority and the truth. A soft commotion erupted as phones came up. Journalists scrambled into position, and the back row pressed forward. The courtroom became a storm of blinking lights and whispered disbelief. Even the defense attorneys, whose silence had grown more desperate by the hour, looked shell-shocked. Judge Stone said nothing. He didn't look at the jury. He didn't look at the bench. He didn't look at her. But Jasmine Crockett looked at him. She rose only halfway, her hands resting lightly on the prosecution table. And in the quietest moment of that chaotic room, she said just one thing: not for the press, not for the cameras, not for revenge, for the record. No one stands above justice. And suddenly the silence returned, heavier than before. What began as a tense courtroom standoff quickly mutated into a national reckoning, because the moment Judge Andrew Stone was escorted from his own courtroom, the walls of secrecy that had long insulated power didn't just crack, they collapsed. By the time Stone had been led past the final row of stunned observers, the first 30-second clip had already hit the internet. Captured by a court reporter's phone, the grainy footage showed the once untouchable judge being calmly escorted by federal agents, his expression hollow, his silence deafening. Within an hour, the clip had amassed over 4 million views. By nightfall, every major cable news outlet ran it on loop, bookended by the same ominous chyron: sitting federal judge detained mid-trial. But it wasn't just the visual. The symbolism was too potent, too raw. For decades, Judge Stone had loomed over courtrooms like a fixed monument of power, his rulings seen as final, his voice unchallengeable. And now, in the span of minutes, he had become the story, a man dragged from behind the bench, unmasked by the very process he once controlled. Across social media, hashtags surged: #, fall of the gavel, #, judge the judge, #, justice reclaimed. This wasn't just viral, it was volcanic. On Capitol Hill, the tremors were immediate. Senators and representatives who had once praised Stone as a model of judicial consistency suddenly found themselves scrambling for distance. By the next morning, 4 sitting U.S. senators released joint statements claiming they were deeply disturbed by the allegations. 3 of them had attended Stone's confirmation hearings. One had accepted over $75,000 in bundled campaign donations connected to Harrington Dynamics, the very company at the heart of the scandal. Within 24 hours, all 4 offices had issued formal notices of returning contributions and reevaluating judicial vetting procedures. A longtime ally of Stone's on the Senate Judiciary Committee was quoted off record saying, "We were warned, but we never thought he'd be arrogant enough to leave fingerprints." What had started in one courtroom now echoed through every power corridor in Washington. The press didn't hold back. The Washington Post labeled it a constitutional tremor. CNN ran a live panel where former federal prosecutors called it an event without precedent in modern jurisprudence. The New York Times editorial board simply called it what it was: a reckoning long overdue. But perhaps the most chilling headline came from a late-night segment on national television, where a legal analyst said, "For years we've told ourselves the robes meant neutrality. Today proved otherwise." Broadcast after broadcast played the clip: Stone's hunched figure, the agents at his sides, and the flashbulbs igniting like gunfire as he stepped into the hallway. Even without sound, the image told the full story. When justice finally turns around, it doesn't knock. It kicks the door open. Inside the federal judiciary, the ripple was no less seismic. That same afternoon, the chief judge of the district officially announced that Judge Andrew Stone had been placed on emergency suspension pending full investigation. More importantly, he issued a reassignment order for every active case on Stone's docket, 47 in total, including 5 high-profile federal trials and multiple class actions. And the case that had started it all, United States versus Harrington Dynamics, that would now be overseen by Judge Lenora Carlisle, a respected, fiercely independent jurist with no ties to the defense or prosecution. Her reputation for surgical legal reasoning and intolerance for procedural theatrics immediately shifted the conversation. The message was unmistakable. This trial was not going to disappear. Not under her watch, not now. But the public wasn't done reckoning. At rallies in Boston, Chicago, and Sacramento, protest signs began appearing with Stone's face crossed out in red. Some read, "How many judges are hiding behind the bench?" Others asked, "How long did they all know?" It wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about the system that protected him. Whispers of internal memos, ignored complaints, and warning signs buried in ethics committees started surfacing in independent watchdog publications. Legal podcasts went into overdrive. Law professors rewrote lecture syllabi in real time. First-year students at Yale, Georgetown, and UCLA all received the same urgent email. Please note, the scheduled module on judicial accountability has been updated. And still, at the center of the whirlwind, Jasmine Crockett said almost nothing. When approached by press outside the courthouse that night, she gave no victory speech, no clever soundbite. She simply said, "We followed the law." The law answered. It wasn't performative. It was the point. She didn't need to celebrate. Because while the cameras had captured the moment Stone was walked out, what mattered far more was everything that came before it. Every denied motion, every condescending remark. Every time someone like her was told the system worked best when unquestioned. She hadn't exposed a man. She had exposed a pattern. The Department of Justice issued a brief statement confirming Stone's detainment and the opening of a multi-agency inquiry. The Judicial Ethics Commission, which had been publicly quiet for months, launched a formal disciplinary review with subpoena authority. Subcommittees in the House and Senate began requesting files. By day 3, the Supreme Court itself issued an internal memo reinforcing the mandatory reporting obligations of all judges regarding financial disclosures and conflicts of interest. What had once been procedural boilerplate was now treated like gospel. Meanwhile, back in courtroom 7A, the plaque bearing Judge Stone's name had been removed. In its place, a temporary nameplate read simply, "Pending reassignment." The wood-paneled chamber, once charged with fear and hierarchy, had been reduced to what it truly was. A room. Just a room. Empty chairs. Blank pages. A bench that no longer commanded reverence but awaited redemption. The story was no longer just viral, it was historical, and it had only just begun. But while the nation reeled, dissecting every frame of the footage and every sentence of the ruling, Jasmine Crockett did what she had always done. She stepped out of the spotlight and walked straight back into the work. The press swarm outside the courthouse was blinding. Dozens of microphones held aloft like weapons, cameras lined shoulder to shoulder, news anchors rehearsing questions designed for viral soundbites. "Congresswoman Crockett, will you be calling for a wider judicial investigation? Do you feel vindicated today? Was this the outcome you were hoping for?" They shouted her name again and again, but she kept walking. She paused only once, under the marbled colonnade of the South Wing, her back lit by the courthouse's stone arch and its newly lowered flag. The moment begged for a headline. Instead, she gave them a sentence. No fist pump, no smile, just steady eyes and a voice worn with clarity. This wasn't a victory. This was a responsibility. Then she turned. No more, no less. The agents behind her nodded silently. Reporters fumbled with their notes. Even the ones hoping for theatrics understood. They weren't looking at a politician. They were watching someone who had just torn down a wall with law alone and now wanted nothing more than to rebuild something better where it had once stood. Crockett didn't take a car to her next stop. She didn't go to a hotel, or a studio, or a luncheon packed with donors. She walked 3 blocks east, stepped into a low-rise federal office near Union Station, and returned to the same conference room where the case had first begun. Its windows still taped with timelines and names, a wall still covered in red string and sealed affidavits. The scent of printer ink and stale coffee filled the air. Her team was already there, waiting. No one said anything. They didn't need to. She dropped her coat on the back of the chair and opened her case file with the same rhythm as always. "Get me the unredacted logs from Harrington's Brazil operation," she said quietly, flipping past yesterday's headlines. "I want every point of contact on their board subpoenaed before the week is out. No excuses." One aide passed her a folder. Another handed her a coffee. Outside, the world was erupting with headlines, talking points, memes, and political fallout. But inside this fluorescent-lit office, it was just names, dates, crimes, and facts. She didn't gloat. She didn't pause, because the case wasn't over. Harrington Dynamics, the billion-dollar machine that had poisoned rivers, bought silence, and buried truth, was still intact. And she wasn't here to celebrate bringing down a judge. She was here to finish the job of holding a corporation accountable. At 11:42 a.m., the New York Times dropped its headline, "The Woman Who Silenced the Gavel." It ran beneath a photo of Jasmine standing still in courtroom 7A, eyes calm, the binder of evidence pressed against her side like a shield forged in truth. The Washington Post followed with, "Crockett's calm, how one voice unraveled a system." MSNBC aired a retrospective montage just hours later. No narration, just real footage. Stone interrupting her, laughing at her, then walking out of his own courtroom under federal escort. The screen faded to black before her closing words echoed once more. "No one stands above justice." And still, she worked. While politicians issued statements and law professors drafted op-eds, Jasmine Crockett pored through spreadsheets of asset transfers, reviewed whistleblower interviews, and coordinated testimony scheduling with the DOJ. Her desk was a maze of printouts and flag sections. A large whiteboard behind her now held two names circled in red. Two Harrington executives who had been previously protected by Stone's rulings. That protection no longer existed. The board also listed 6 other trial dockets. Cases once silenced, now unlocked. It wasn't glamour, it was grit. This was the part no cameras ever covered. The hours, the deadlines, the strategy meetings conducted in low voices while the country screamed. At 2:16 p.m., a staffer brought her a tablet with the LA Times editorial queued up. "Not all heroes wear robes." She didn't read it. She didn't have time. She marked a financial transfer on a page and turned to her deputy. "File a parallel inquiry in the Cayman disclosures." "We're not missing this window." The deputy nodded. "Already drafted." News outlets tried to reach her office over 100 times that day. She took none of the calls. Not out of arrogance, but out of purpose. Because every second she spent being congratulated was a second Harrington's lawyers could use to stall discovery. Her focus didn't waver, not for one heartbeat. As the afternoon wore on, her team became a quiet storm of movement. Printing, redacting, filing, cross-referencing, compiling. They knew the cameras outside wanted a story. Jasmine knew she still had one to finish writing in federal court. By the time dusk fell over D.C., casting long golden lines across the office windows, Jasmine was still in her chair. A nearly empty coffee cup sat beside her. The headlines were still coming in, louder now, more explosive. A former circuit judge had gone on record claiming he once raised concerns about Stone's rulings and was told to mind his lane. A former Harrington accountant was requesting whistleblower protection. Congressional oversight hearings were being scheduled. A Senate Ethics Subcommittee had requested her full trial record. The machine had started turning, and she had been the wrench thrown into its gears. But Jasmine wasn't watching any of it. She highlighted a phrase in a witness statement and wrote a single note in the margin: "Follow the supply contract." There would be no press tour, no book deal, no moment of personal glory. Because what she had done in that courtroom wasn't meant to be remembered as a spectacle. It was meant to be remembered as a warning. And as she closed the last folder of the evening and stood to gather her things, a small TV in the corner flickered with a CNN headline she didn't see. "The prosecutor who refused to flinch." She didn't need to. The work was just beginning. While Jasmine Crockett buried herself in case files and sealed exhibits, unaware or unconcerned with the headlines carrying her name, the shock wave she had unleashed traveled outward, beyond the courthouse, beyond the city, into every corner of American law where silence had once been currency. By the end of the week, the name Stone was no longer just associated with the judge. It had become a cautionary symbol etched into the very framework of legal education and judicial oversight. In law schools from Stanford to Columbia, professors wheeled whiteboards into classrooms and rewrote entire modules mid-semester. Lectures originally meant to cover procedural norms now opened with slides titled The Crockett Confrontation: What Happens When a System Collides with Accountability. In one crowded auditorium at the University of Chicago, a constitutional law professor paused her opening remarks to gesture toward a projected image of Courtroom 7A. "This is no longer theoretical," she told her students. "This is what happens when precedent meets defiance." Students who had once dreamed of clerking under federal judges now exchanged looks of unease. A classroom that had always revered black robes now questioned what those robes had hidden. At Georgetown Law, the trial was dissected frame by frame. Transcripts were analyzed like sacred texts, and the phrase "Crockett will never make it to a jury" was pinned to a bulletin board under the heading Bias in Practice. In moot courtrooms across the country, student arguments shifted. No longer did they rehearse polite debates. They simulated real conflict, power leveraged against truth, reputations weaponized to suppress evidence. At Harvard, one third-year student remarked during a symposium, "This wasn't a courtroom drama. It was a legal exorcism." The room fell quiet, not out of disagreement, but out of recognition, because every aspiring lawyer understood now. The law didn't always yield to the just. Sometimes it yielded to the loudest, unless someone louder stood up. But it wasn't just students. Inside the hallways of real courthouses, state, district, and circuit, the ripple hit harder. Judges across the country began issuing memos to their clerks. New reminders about ex parte communications, reminders about recusal disclosures, reminders to refile financial interest forms even if no changes had occurred. In one courthouse in Denver, a magistrate called an unscheduled staff meeting to discuss ethics protocols in light of recent events. The staff nodded, but the tension in the room said more than the agenda. Some judges looked shaken. Others looked insulted. A few asked if the meeting was being recorded. In one Texas district court, an anonymous judge was overheard saying, "This is going to lead to witch hunts. One clip, and we'll all be on camera." But even that sentiment carried an unspoken truth. They knew the ground beneath them had shifted, and the ones who had nothing to hide weren't panicked. They were grateful. One federal judge in Michigan, when asked by a local reporter whether the Stone incident had damaged public trust, replied, "No. It exposed why the public never trusted us in the first place." Whispers moved through chambers in Florida, Pennsylvania, and Arizona. Judges who had once dismissed courtroom behavior as just style began reviewing old footage of their own proceedings. One even contacted a court stenographer and asked for transcripts of bench comments made years earlier. A former law clerk in Seattle tweeted, "Every judge I've worked for is either rereading the code of conduct or avoiding it like fire." Court staff in New Jersey said they'd never seen so many senior judges voluntarily update their financial disclosures in a single day. The conversation had changed. It was no longer about what Crockett had done. It was about what had been allowed to happen for so long. Lawyers who once feared retribution for filing misconduct complaints now began to speak, quietly at first, then louder. A former federal prosecutor in Ohio wrote an op-ed titled, "I lost a case because I was interrupted 17 times in 11 minutes." It went viral overnight. Another assistant U.S. attorney recounted how her entire submission had been dismissed by a judge with the words, "Come back when you've got more than righteous outrage." Crockett's trial had pulled the curtain back, and what stood behind it wasn't just one man. It was a pattern, and now it had a name. Inside the administrative office of the U.S. courts, the response came swiftly. An internal bulletin was sent to every judicial district with updated guidance on real-time recusal tracking, digital audit logs, and a revised template for financial disclosures. No longer voluntary, no longer once a year. Oversight committees reconvened emergency sessions. Retired judges were brought back to consult on reform. Whistleblower hotlines posted record call volume in just 4 days. Judicial watchdog groups, long dismissed as fringe or overzealous, suddenly found themselves invited to meetings they had been denied access to for years. In a courthouse in Los Angeles, a first-year law clerk noticed something she had never seen before. Her supervising judge paused before interrupting an attorney. It lasted only 2 seconds, but it happened, and that alone meant everything was different now. A reporter from Reuters summarized the moment best. Jasmine Crockett didn't just bring down a judge. She brought a mirror into every courtroom. And in those reflections, the American legal system was seeing itself. Clearly, maybe for the first time in decades. Some recoiled, others stood straighter. But no one pretended not to see. While legal textbooks were being rewritten and courtroom clerks revised their ethics protocols, the tremors finally reached Washington, D.C. But these weren't just metaphorical ripples. They were legislative shockwaves, and they cracked straight through the vaulted ceilings of Capitol Hill. The story of a disgraced federal judge being removed mid-trial had gone beyond headlines. It had infiltrated the very foundations of American democracy, and the institution that had long chosen polite distance over direct intervention was now dragged to the edge of accountability: the United States Congress. The hearing was scheduled in less than 6 days, record time by government standards. But the urgency was palpable. The name on every senator's lips wasn't Stone, it was Crockett. Room 2141 of the Rayburn House office building was transformed into a theater of reckoning. At the center was a long oak table lined with microphones, affidavits, sealed binders, and trembling glasses of water. The plaque read, "Special Hearing on Judicial Ethics and Oversight Reform." But every person in the room understood the truth. This was not policymaking, it was damage control. The session opened under Klieg lights and wall-to-wall media coverage. Representatives and senators leaned in, not for effect, but because they knew the stakes. This wasn't political theater. This was the first time in a generation that Congress was being forced to examine the judiciary not as a sacred pillar of democracy, but as a flawed human institution, vulnerable to the same corruption it was built to judge. The first witness, a retired appellate judge from California, face lined with age and regret, voice steadied by conviction. "What we saw in courtroom 7A was not an anomaly. It was a reflection," he declared, "and the only reason it stunned the nation is because we've hidden the mirror for too long." As he spoke, the chamber sat in dead silence. Not even phones clicked. Then came whistleblowers, clerks, junior attorneys, former ethics officers. They brought files, screenshots, audio logs. One woman, shaking as she unsealed her envelope, testified, "I was threatened with professional blacklisting for flagging a judge's financial entanglements. When I saw Jasmine Crockett stand alone and speak the truth while the nation watched, I realized maybe we're not alone anymore." Each revelation landed heavier than the last. One affidavit named 2 sitting judges in major securities trials who had received undisclosed honoraria from nonprofits linked to Harrington Dynamics. Another described pressure from court administrators to bury recusals in footnotes rather than open records. One even included a redacted transcript of a backroom conversation between a judge and defense counsel, mocking plaintiffs and laughing about how no one reads ethics filings anyway. But the most devastating blow didn't come from testimony, it came from action, outside the room. As the hearings progressed, a stunning pattern emerged in real time. One by one across the country, federal judges began stepping down from major financial cases without explanation. It started with a recusal notice in Boston. Judge Kessler, citing possible perceived bias, removed herself from a merger trial involving a tech conglomerate. Within hours, 2 more judges in New York quietly exited cases tied to pharmaceutical lobbying groups. Then came the cascade. In less than 72 hours, over a dozen recusals were filed in high-stakes corporate lawsuits. Every one of them, every single one, had some historical tie to either Stone, Harrington, or the closed-door judicial retreats exposed by journalists following the Crockett case. By Friday afternoon, a memo leaked from within the Federal Judicial Center, warning of a pending crisis of confidence in judicial continuity. But it was already too late. The message was clear. Stone had fallen, and now others were scrambling to avoid being next. And Congress? Congress was watching. Senator Lila Bradshaw, a moderate with a history of deference to the courts, shattered protocol when she slammed her pen down mid-hearing and asked, How many people have lost cases they should have won because we turned a blind eye? No one answered. No one needed to. Her voice echoed across the marble walls like a verdict. Reform proposals began to stack high on the committee desk. A real-time, publicly searchable judicial finance database. A statutory obligation for automatic ethics review of judges presiding over cases with parties linked to their family, donors, or prior consulting roles. A new independent judicial inspector general outside the purview of the Supreme Court. Mandatory audio-visual recording of all federal courtroom activity, including chambers meetings. But the most anticipated bill of all was born from a single sentence spoken in courtroom 7A. She'll never make it to the jury. Lawmakers turned that quote into a rallying cry and then into legislation. It was named the Jury Access Integrity Act, and it would require federal judges to formally record any off-the-record decision that affects trial fairness or limits access to jury presentation, with disciplinary review if patterns emerge. It had co-sponsors from both parties within 48 hours. And while debates swirled over judicial independence versus judicial secrecy, one undeniable reality crystallized. Jasmine Crockett had set something in motion that could no longer be stopped. Judges who once shook hands with defense counsel at golf tournaments now skipped bar association dinners. Judicial conferences turned into closed sessions behind tighter doors. Some judges asked to be reassigned, not because they were guilty, but because the very perception of guilt now carried weight. Even law students shifted career goals. Many began to reject clerkships from judges who had remained silent during the Stone fallout. And yet, amidst the chaos, there was one constant refrain whispered across every floor of the Capitol. This never would have happened if Crockett had just backed down, but she didn't. And now, neither could they. While Congress raged and headlines flared, a quieter storm was gathering around one name. Not in the halls of power, but in living rooms, kitchens, libraries, and dormitories. Jasmine Crockett. Not as a meme, not as a trending topic, but as a catalyst, a symbol of what it looked like when someone refused to bow to power and instead walked straight into the fire carrying only the truth in a spine of steel. Her office, tucked in the 5th floor of a modest building off Polk Street, was never designed for public worship. The walls were bare, the windows were functional, the lighting cold and efficient. There were no portraits of herself, no shelves packed with awards. But by the second week after Judge Stone's fall, the space had begun to overflow with something far more powerful than trophies. Letters, not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands. Mailed, hand-delivered, couriered. Some were addressed formally to the Honorable Jasmine Crockett. Others simply read, "To the woman who stood up when no one else would." They came in all forms: manila envelopes with legal files, folded notebook paper from juvenile centers, cards with flowers drawn in crayon, even one on a napkin from a Waffle House with the words, "You made my daughter ask what justice means." I didn't know what to say, but now I do. From every corner of the country, Texas, Vermont, Idaho, Florida, people were writing not to a politician, but to a mirror, to someone who had made them feel seen in a system built to ignore them. Law students wrote to say they'd changed their thesis topics. A former district attorney from Oregon sent a 17-page confession about how many times he'd looked away under political pressure. Even a federal marshal sent a short note on official letterhead, simply saying, "I wish I'd had the guts to do what you did. Thank you for reminding me what my badge was supposed to mean." Still, Jasmine refused the noise. She didn't appear on the late shows, didn't accept CNN's invitation for a primetime exclusive, didn't smile for Time magazine's camera crew when they arrived unannounced with a bouquet and a bottle of champagne. She wasn't chasing the spotlight because she knew what it cost and what it distracted from. "I'm not a symbol," she told her team. "I'm a civil servant. I'm not done yet." Inside her office, stacked in boxes labeled not by state but by theme, wrongful evictions, corporate misconduct, suppressed evidence, Stone-era cases, Jasmine quietly read the letters at night after her staff went home. A janitor once came in and found her sitting in silence at 11:30 p.m., eyes red but posture straight, holding a 3-page letter from a woman in Georgia who had lost her home after a Stone ruling dismissed her environmental lawsuit without explanation. The letter ended with, "For years I thought I was invisible. Then I saw you stand up, and I felt human again." She folded it gently, placed it in a sleeve, and filed it in a box labeled "Stay Grounded." There were no cameras to witness it, and that was exactly how she wanted it. She turned down every award nomination, refused the proposed documentary deal, told her staff to reject any offer that required recapping what had happened in courtroom 7A. She wasn't interested in being immortalized. She was interested in finishing the work. In her desk drawer, under lock, were the next 10 case files. And they weren't small. Harrington Dynamics might have been exposed, but its subsidiaries and partner firms were still quietly operating across multiple states with the same tactics, the same shell companies, and the same willingness to sacrifice lives for profit. She marked each case with red tabs, handwritten notes lining the margins. Follow the inspection records. Cross-check board member ties. Revisit EPA whistleblower from 2019. While the world saw a hero resting after a victory, she was building the next battlefield. But for all her discipline, her door remained open. One morning, a group of law students from Howard University stood outside her office, clutching a folder of mock trial briefs and asking if they could just see where it happened. They expected a security guard, a closed door, maybe a receptionist telling them to make an appointment. Instead, Crockett herself stepped into the hall, smiled softly, and said, "You've got 10 minutes. Bring your best question." They ended up staying 2 hours. She didn't give speeches. She didn't deliver monologues. She just listened, asked questions, challenged their assumptions. When one student timidly asked if she ever felt afraid in that courtroom, Jasmine nodded. "Yes, but fear isn't weakness," she said. "It's the tax you pay for doing something that matters." As they left, she handed them photocopies of her opening argument, redacted, not for secrecy, but to encourage them to fill in the gaps with their own voice someday. Still, the public wanted a quote, a banner, something to stamp on mugs or tweet under hashtags. She refused, again and again. And then, one Monday morning, without announcement, without ceremony, she walked into her office early, before even the cleaning crew had finished, took a sheet of printer paper and a black Sharpie, and wrote 11 words, in block letters, no italics, no decoration. Justice is not a title. It is a decision made every day. She taped it to the inside of her frosted glass door, facing outward, just high enough that anyone walking down the hallway could see it, but low enough that they had to slow down to read it. No one knew she had done it. No memo was sent. But by noon, staffers from other floors began coming up to see it for themselves. By that Friday, someone from a legal aid office had printed it on bookmarks and started passing them out at bar association meetings. By Sunday, it was trending on social media, not because she posted it, but because someone else did. And through it all, Jasmine never once paused her casework, not to bask, not to celebrate, not to rest. Because she understood something most people still hadn't grasped. Bringing down one corrupt judge wasn't the end of the war, it was the end of the illusion. Now came the harder part, rebuilding a system that had normalized its own silence. In the quiet of her office, beneath the weight of letters, lawsuits, and the whispered prayers of strangers she would never meet, Jasmine Crockett didn't feel victorious. She felt responsible, and that was enough. And while the courtroom doors closed behind her for the day, what lingered wasn't silence. It was the question. Not the legal one, nor the procedural one, but the kind that weighs heavier the longer it echoes. What kind of justice system needs someone to nearly sacrifice everything just to make it function? That question didn't vanish with Judge Stone's removal, nor with the thousands of headlines praising Jasmine Crockett's courage. It hung in the air, between the fluorescent lights of classrooms, in the pause before gavels fell, in the eyes of every judge now asked to sign a warrant, approve a deal, dismiss a case, and it followed her. Not like a shadow, but like a responsibility, one she didn't run from. Because the real story wasn't just about corruption. It was about what we do when the people sworn to protect the system are the very ones breaking it. Jasmine Crockett knew this better than most. The fight hadn't begun in that federal courtroom. It had started long before, In low-income neighborhoods where poisoned water was blamed on bad plumbing, in boardrooms where campaign donations disguised themselves as civic gestures, in court transcripts where evidence vanished quietly between the lines. And what made it worse wasn't just that it happened, but that it kept happening. Because no one wanted to believe that justice, real justice, required confrontation, required sacrifice, required uncomfortable truth. The human lesson wasn't written in the law books. It wasn't underlined in the Constitution. It was written in the lives of those who never made it to trial. The children whose asthma rates spiked in towns with Harrington factories. The tenants evicted after court rulings that cited no reason beyond insufficient cause for injunction. The whistleblowers fired in silence while judges like Stone called them unreliable from the bench. Jasmine carried those stories into court, not because it made her stronger, but because it made her honest. And honesty, in a system trained to punish it, became her sharpest weapon. She didn't fight for perfection. She fought for possibility, for the belief that the law doesn't have to be cruel just because it's complicated. That precedent is not prophecy. That if justice wears a blindfold, maybe it's time someone taught her how to listen. And when the system screamed back, called her emotional, aggressive, radical, she didn't flinch. She stayed rooted, because the lesson wasn't about winning, it was about refusing to accept that injustice is inevitable. The cameras showed the climax. A judge removed, a courtroom in uproar, a nation shocked. But the true weight of the moment lived in the quiet after. In the hallway where a court janitor nodded at her without saying a word. In the email from a paralegal who said her daughter cried watching the live stream, not out of sadness, but because someone like us finally got to speak. It was in those small moments where the fight felt less like a headline and more like healing. But healing doesn't come easily. It never has. Because the deeper lesson Jasmine had to learn and live was that you don't dismantle a rotten wall by yelling at it. You dismantle it brick by brick, even when your hands bleed. And sometimes the wall pushes back. Hard. There were nights when she sat in her car after work, hands still shaking from the tension of the day. Nights when threats came not as phone calls but in subtle ways. Delays in scheduling, cold stares from clerks, former allies who now avoided her in public. Being right didn't protect her. It isolated her. But the lesson there, too, was necessary. Courage isn't about being safe. It's about being steady, about showing up anyway, about knowing the price and paying it with both hands. And yet, amid the struggle, something else had quietly begun to shift. Law professors rewrote syllabi, ethics committees launched new training requirements, prosecutors in other districts opened old cases once dismissed under Stone's jurisdiction. A ripple had formed, and Jasmine wasn't at the center of it. She was simply the first stone thrown into a stagnant pond. That was enough, because the true victory, the real human lesson, wasn't in a guilty verdict or a judge stepping down. It was in the idea that a broken system doesn't stay broken by accident. It stays broken because people are afraid to challenge it. But now they'd seen someone do just that, and they couldn't unsee it. Jasmine's story became more than just an event. It became a mirror, and it asked hard questions of every American who watched. What do you do when the system protects itself instead of you? Who gets heard when justice speaks? And who gets silenced? What happens when the courtroom becomes a stage for power, not truth? Those questions didn't come with answers. They came with demands for transparency, for reform, for the idea that maybe, just maybe, justice isn't a statue or a courtroom. It's a person standing up when it would be easier to sit down. And perhaps the most haunting lesson of all was this. Corruption doesn't always look like a bribe. Sometimes it looks like routine, like procedure, like precedent left unchecked. That's what made Crockett's stand so dangerous to those in power, because she didn't accuse wildly or rant emotionally. She simply showed the receipts, the wire transfers, the leaked audio, the pattern too consistent to be coincidence. And by doing that, she turned the courtroom into a confession booth and forced the nation to listen. That's where change begins. Not in shouts, but in silence that finally gets broken. And for the thousands watching who'd once believed the legal system would never care about people like them, Jasmine's fire lit a very different truth. Sometimes it only takes one person refusing to be quiet to break centuries of silence. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In a live high-stakes Senate hearing, Caroline Leavitt unleashes a flawless AI-generated video designed to destroy Jasmine Crockett, a deepfake so convincing it shows Jasmine backing 9-month abortions in her own voice and face. For a moment, it seems like Jasmine's reputation is about to be destroyed. But just minutes later, Jasmine strikes back, calmly dropping irrefutable evidence that not only exposes the fake, but ties it directly to Caroline's inner circle. The hearing erupts. The narrative shatters. The predator becomes the exposed. If Congress itself can be hijacked by synthetic lies, what's left to trust when even your outrage is manipulated? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the blinding ceiling lights of room 1100, the chairman raised his gavel. The room froze. Bang! "This hearing will come to order," he announced, voice cutting clean through the chatter. "Today, we will examine the growing impact of artificial intelligence and deepfake technology on the future of American democracy." The words echoed like a warning shot. Every camera locked in. Every phone went live. The stakes had just shifted from legislative to existential. Caroline Leavitt sat on the right side of the hearing table, flanked by Republican aides and framed by sympathetic media. Her posture was impeccable, shoulders back, chin raised, every inch the polished mouthpiece of a government that claimed control over technology meant freedom. She smirked slightly, already rehearsing her talking points. Behind her, conservative outlets whispered anticipation, already scripting her win. Across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, stone-faced, silent. She didn't look at the cameras, didn't look at Caroline. Her focus was dead ahead. In front of her lay a small silver USB drive, positioned with intention beside a thick folder clamped shut, labeled in plain black font, "Classified Centralogic." No advisors hovered, no allies whispered, just her and the truth she carried like a loaded weapon. The silence around her wasn't weakness. It was precision. The power imbalance was glaring. One woman sat surrounded, armored in narrative and noise. The other sat alone, cornered, quiet, and underestimated. But Jasmine didn't need noise. She had evidence. And as Caroline adjusted her mic with a confident smile, Jasmine's hand shifted an inch closer to the USB. Not to threaten, just to remind. She hadn't come to defend herself. She had come to expose something no one in that room was ready to face. And just as the echo of the gavel vanished into the marble silence of the chamber, Caroline Leavitt leaned forward with calculated poise, her fingers gently tapping the polished wood, her eyes scanning the room like a performer gauging her captive audience. "Before we begin," she said with a practiced breathiness that cloaked cruelty and civility, "I believe we should take a moment to recognize a clip that sparked, let's just say, significant public interest." Her voice curved upward as if teasing a revelation, and at that exact moment, one of her aides, young, stone-faced, earpiece glinting under the lights, hit a key on the laptop beside her. The room dimmed slightly. The central screen behind the chairman flickered, then bloomed into life. And there it was. Jasmine Crockett appeared on screen, sitting against a studio backdrop in muted tones. Her posture familiar, her face unmistakable. The voice, seamless, timbre, cadence, even the rhythm of her breath between sentences. But then came the line, "I support abortion through the 9th month. Sometimes it's the only path to liberation." The words sliced the air like a razor. Audible gasps burst across the hearing room like a chain reaction of disbelief. A woman in the gallery dropped her notepad. One congressman turned in his seat and muttered, "That can't be real." Another from South Dakota wasn't so reserved. He stood halfway and spat, "Unbelievable." Dozens of reporters surged forward instinctively, phones raised, cameras clicking like angry insects. Keyboards lit up in unison, reporters typing furiously as editors shouted through Bluetooth earpieces. On the feed streaming to millions of homes, the caption ran in bold, "Crockett supports full-term abortions?" Caroline reclined ever so slightly, folding her hands in front of her as if she hadn't just fired the opening salvo of a war she'd been planning for weeks. She didn't look at Jasmine. She didn't have to. Her message had landed. In that moment, she wasn't testifying. She was prosecuting, delivering Exhibit A not in a courtroom of facts, but in a theater of perception. And the worst part? No one questioned it. No one asked who produced the clip. No one asked for verification. They just watched. And Jasmine Crockett, still, composed, spine rigid like forged steel, absorbed every gaze like a target on a firing line. She had seen this clip already. She knew the sound design, the frame rate matching, the voice synthesis, AI generated, tailored, malicious. She knew it wasn't real, but the way it was broadcast now, on record before Congress, preserved in the public imagination like a confession, it might as well have been. That was the genius of the weapon. It didn't need to be true. It only needed to feel true. And with every second it played unchecked, with every pair of eyes that refused to blink, a lie calcified into memory. This wasn't just defamation. This was digital crucifixion. And Jasmine hadn't even opened her mouth yet. The clip faded to black, but its shadow clung to the walls of the hearing room like smoke after detonation. For a moment, there was only the low murmur of confusion. Chairs creaking, aides whispering, reporters typing in a frenzy. Then Jasmine Crockett leaned in, clicked her mic on, and spoke. Not with anger, not with panic, but with the deadly calm of someone who had just been tried in public without a trial. "I did not say those words," she began, her voice quiet but magnetic, forcing the room to listen. "That video is not mine. It is not real. It is not even human. It is a synthetic product, an AI-engineered deception crafted to mimic my face, my voice, my breath, but not my truth." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "And I am prepared to prove it." As she gestured behind her, a man in his 40s wearing a navy gray suit and wireframe glasses stood from the second bench. He carried no notes, just a laptop under one arm and a government clearance badge that read DOJ Digital Forensics Division. He nodded once at Jasmine and stepped toward the auxiliary display. Within seconds, he connected his machine. The room's main monitor flickered, then shifted from the frozen thumbnail of the viral clip to a set of spectrographic waveforms, pitch variations, and visual frame breakdowns. Each chart ready to dissect the fraud down to the pixel. The tension twisted tighter. The truth was ready to surface, line by line, frame by frame. But before the first graph could be explained, before a single word of science reached the record, a voice snapped across the room like a whip. "Let's be honest," Caroline Levitt interjected, her mic already live. She didn't look rattled. She looked triumphant. "We're not here to nitpick spectrograms," she said, lifting her chin, eyes scanning the gallery of cameras. "We're here to address what the American people see and hear. We're here to talk about perception." She let the word linger, like it was more sacred than fact. Congresswoman Crockett can argue about what's real or fake all she wants, but voters aren't waiting on lab results. They've already heard her voice. They've already formed their opinions. The words hit harder than any data ever could. It wasn't just a dismissal of evidence. It was a rejection of reality itself. Jasmine hadn't even been allowed to present her defense before her credibility was reframed as irrelevant. The room, which had briefly tilted toward the possibility of truth, snapped back under the weight of Caroline's insinuation. That truth was optional, and belief was king. Jasmine didn't flinch, but her silence became heavier. She was now a defendant in a trial with no judge, no rules, only a jury of millions watching from their phones, scrolling past nuance to find conviction in 15 seconds or less. And in that moment, it became painfully clear. She wasn't just fighting a lie. She was fighting a machine built to outpace the truth, and a system that cheered as it did. And in the wake of silenced truth, Caroline Levitt filled the void with certainty, cold, clinical, and impeccably rehearsed. With a flick of her wrist, she activated the touchscreen embedded in the desk before her. Let's walk through what this technology actually does, she began. Her voice dipped in polished authority, as if she were guiding children through a museum of the future. The overhead monitor changed instantly. The congressional seal faded into a glowing interface of neural maps, waveform grids, and facial recognition models rotating in 3D. She rose slightly in her seat, not enough to look aggressive, just enough to command reverence. This system, she declared, tapping the screen to advance the visuals, is designed to track micro-expressions, vocal stress patterns, and behavioral markers across digital platforms. Its purpose is simple: detect and neutralize misinformation before it metastasizes. She pointed to a heat map of a human face. Green, yellow, red zones pulsing with algorithmic confidence. Next came audiographs illustrating pitch elevation, word cadence, and frequency spikes. Whether it's a speech, a live stream, or a podcast, she continued, the AI cross-references tone, language, and context with verified data sources in real time. If deviations are found, the statement is flagged, traced, and categorized. Her words were precise, mechanical, too efficient to be questioned. Yet beneath the technical sheen was something far more sinister, an invisible tribunal of code deciding what truth was allowed to exist. This isn't censorship, she said, as if reading from scripture. This is national security. In an era of viral lies, we need a system that sees past charisma and exposes intent. But before the frost of her final statement could melt, Caroline pressed deeper, her confidence now swelling with the rhythm of a practiced crescendo. In the past 90 days alone, she said, with the cadence of a verdict, our system has identified and verified 200 discrete falsehoods propagated by political candidates on both sides of the aisle. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The data would do the shouting for her. With a single swipe, the screen behind her filled with a mosaic of digital profiles, each tied to a timestamp, a statement, and a damning red label. Confirmed false. A rolling list of names began to scroll, some known, some obscure, all neatly cataloged as if misinformation were a product SQ. Alongside each one was a heat map of voice stress indicators, facial micro-expressions, and engagement spikes across platforms. The air grew tighter, more sterile, like the oxygen had been replaced by circuitry. She advanced the slide again, revealing a second screen, bar graphs, trend lines, a glowing pie chart breaking down violations by topic: economy, immigration, healthcare, elections. Each case, she continued, was reviewed by credentialed analysts within our oversight framework and corroborated using multi-platform behavioral analytics. There is no guesswork here, only verified deviation from objective reality. Her voice hit that word, objective, like it was sacred. No one interrupted. No one challenged the numbers. The committee leaned in unconsciously. Even the Democratic members, ones who had whispered frustration just moments ago, now watched Caroline with expressions that hovered between hesitation and reluctant intrigue. And Jasmine sat still, eyes fixed, hands clasped so tightly in her lap, her knuckles paled to white. Because she knew what the room didn't. Those numbers were not the story. They were the stagecraft, a performance, data without scrutiny, methodologies without transparency. And somewhere buried in that glowing grid of red flags was her name, reduced to a line of code, a digital conviction rendered without trial. The crowd wasn't applauding justice. They were hypnotized by control disguised as clarity, and the woman who had come to expose a lie was now watching it metastasize into gospel. But no matter how carefully a lie is built, it begins to fall the moment it faces undeniable truth. Jasmine Crockett waited only a moment, as if measuring the gravity of what she was about to release. Then she stood. No dramatic movements, no loud declarations, just calm focus. She walked to the center table where the main screen controls were set, the eyes of the room following her like heat-seeking missiles. In her hand, she held the same small silver USB drive that had been sitting in front of her all morning. Quiet, unnoticed, patient. But now it was about to become a weapon. She plugged it in. The large screen behind the committee chair flickered. For a split second, the image was black. Then it lit up with something that made the entire room still. It was the same video Caroline Levitt had shown earlier, the one where Jasmine appeared to be saying she supported abortion in the 9th month. Same background, same voice, same face. But this time, something was different. Jasmine turned to the room. Her voice was sharp, steady. "This," she said, pointing to the screen, "is the video Ms. Levitt shared with the world. Millions have seen it. Many believed it. But what no one saw, what you were not meant to see, is this." She pressed a key. The image zoomed into the lower right corner. There, hidden in near-invisible print, was a faint watermark. Now enlarged, it was impossible to miss. The words were plain. "Created using software owned by CentralLogic. Internal version, not for public use." A wave of silence swept the room. Not quiet, shock. Some members of Congress leaned forward. Reporters stared, wide-eyed, fingers frozen over their keyboards. Aides began whispering to their bosses. The watermark wasn't an opinion. It wasn't a theory. It was proof, technical, undeniable, that the video was a fake and that it had been created using tools never meant to be seen by the public. Jasmine didn't pause. She continued. "This program," she said, "is not available to everyday users. It's not on the internet. It's not open to researchers. It's used only inside a private company that designs technology to copy people's voices and faces." She moved to the next screen. Now a report appeared showing the exact details of the video file. The time it was created, just 48 hours ago. The location it came from, an internet address in Northern Virginia. Jasmine clicked again, showing a registration record of who owned the network behind that address. One name stood out, bold and clear. NR Strategic Holdings. Nicholas Riccio. She looked up, letting the room connect the final dot. "For those unfamiliar," she said calmly, "Nicholas Riccio is the husband of Ms. Levitt." You could almost hear the air shift. A soft gasp came from the back rows. A staffer dropped a pen. One congressman muttered something under his breath. A CNN producer leaned into his earpiece. "We need this on air, now." Jasmine stood still, centered under the overhead lights. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "This wasn't a random attack," she said. "This wasn't a stranger on the internet trying to smear me. This was a deliberate effort to create a fake video using private software. Software that isn't supposed to be in the public's hands. And the company behind it is directly tied to the family of the person sitting across from me today." Caroline Levitt didn't speak. Her face was frozen in a half-smile that no longer fit the room. She blinked once, maybe twice, but didn't move. Her hands stayed clasped in front of her, still, tense. The polished poise she carried for the last hour had cracked. Not broken, but it was no longer impenetrable. Jasmine wasn't finished. "This isn't just about me," she said, now turning back to the full committee. "This is about what happens when technology is used, not to reveal truth, but to replace it. This is what happens when a machine is used to tell the public what to believe, not based on facts, but based on power." She paused. "We now know what was used. We know when it was used, and now we know who had access to the tools, who had the motive, who had the connection, and who had everything to gain by making sure this lie went viral before I had a chance to speak." The screen behind her froze on the watermark again. A single line of text that now felt like a confession written in code. "This isn't just a political tactic," Jasmine said. "This is a digital attack on democracy. And today, it has a name, and it has fingerprints." Now the committee members were no longer looking at her with suspicion. Their gazes had changed. They weren't waiting for her to defend herself. They were processing what they had just seen, what they had almost believed. They looked at Caroline, some in silence, some in clear discomfort. A few shifted in their chairs, unsure of what came next, and Jasmine stood in that silence, not as someone pleading for her name back, but as someone who had just taken control of the room without shouting a single word. At the edge of the massive screen, the watermark still glowed, a ghost of the truth they tried to bury, and proof that someone, somewhere, had hoped no one would ever look that closely. They were wrong, And just when it seemed the chamber could not be pushed any further, Jasmine reached for something that didn't glow or blink, something silent and heavy. Her fingers closed around a black folder beneath her notes. It wasn't flashy. It didn't need to be. The edges were creased. The surface was worn. But as she slowly stood and held it in her hands, the shift in the room was unmistakable. This wasn't just another document. It felt different, like something no one was supposed to see. The room stilled again. Journalists froze mid-sentence. Caroline shifted slightly for the first time in minutes, her gaze narrowing almost instinctively. Jasmine didn't look at anyone as she opened the folder, only the screen behind her. The contents had already been scanned and prepared. She pressed a single key. The image appeared, the cover page of an internal document from Central Logic. Not a presentation deck, not a press release, a private report. The heading was clear, typed in bold black at the top of the page. Proposal, Deepfake Strategy Testing. Manipulated content for public perception analysis. Even the title had teeth. It wasn't coded or ambiguous. It didn't hide behind soft language or vague terms. It said exactly what it was. A plan to test deepfake videos on real people. A psychological experiment wearing the clothes of innovation. The room reacted immediately. A few senators sat back in their chairs. A staffer near the back covered her mouth. One congressman shook his head slowly, like something sacred had just been violated. Jasmine's voice cut back through the tension. Calm, focused, almost too steady. This document was never supposed to be seen outside the walls of Central Logic, she said. It wasn't meant for journalists. It wasn't meant for the public. It was meant for investors and insiders who wanted to know how far this technology could go before anyone noticed. She tapped again. The screen changed to a page halfway through the report, a section highlighted in yellow, blown up for everyone to see. No spin, no filter. Target demographic: Black progressive women in swing states. The words sat on the screen like poison. No one spoke. No one moved. You could feel it. The quiet recognition that this wasn't an accident, that someone somewhere had drawn a circle around a specific group of Americans and decided, this is who we will deceive. This is where we will strike. This, Jasmine said softly, is not an algorithm gone rogue. This is a plan, a decision, an attack by design. Her voice sharpened, not in volume, but in purpose. She didn't look at the screen anymore. She turned directly toward Caroline, her hands still calmly resting on the edges of the folder, like it was a shield forged in silence. You didn't just come after me, she said. You came after women who look like me, women who fight like me, who speak like me. You didn't try to silence the loudest voice. You tried to confuse the crowd behind it. She stepped forward slightly, not aggressive, not theatrical, just firm, anchored. You didn't aim at me because I'm wrong. You aimed because you knew if the truth I carry is allowed to breathe, then the lie you built will collapse under its own weight. The room still didn't move. Caroline blinked, once. Her jaw tightened slightly, but she didn't speak. Jasmine turned back to the audience. Her tone dropped. Low, heavy. Let's be clear about what this is. This wasn't just about making people believe something false. This was about targeting a group of voters whose voices already fight to be heard. It was about using technology, the same kind we were told would protect elections, to rig emotions instead. She paused. It's not a coincidence that the demographic listed here is the one that consistently swings elections. It's not a coincidence that we are the same voices that get ignored until it's time to be blamed or silenced. She held up the folder. This didn't come from a hacker. It came from inside a boardroom. It came from people with titles and salaries who call this strategy. And the moment that deep fake of me hit the internet, that strategy had a face. Mine. No one interrupted her. No one dared. This isn't about feelings. It's about power. And someone decided the fastest way to keep it was to confuse the people most likely to challenge it. She dropped the folder onto the table, not with force, but with finality. The soft thud was louder than anything said that morning. Then she looked back at Caroline. Not with rage, with understanding. The kind that says, I see you now, all of you. You aim for people like me, she said again, quiet but unshakable. Because you knew, if the truth survived, the lie wouldn't stand a chance. And in that moment, the room knew it too. The fake video had tried to turn her into a puppet. The document tried to reduce her to a number. But Jasmine had just done what the algorithms could not predict. She made herself real, and in doing so, she made their strategy impossible to unsee. And as the final image of the internal memo dimmed behind Jasmine, the words target demographic, Black progressive women, still burning in the minds of everyone in the chamber, the pressure finally cracked through Caroline Levitt's composure like glass under a storm. She stood up suddenly, her chair scraping back against the polished floor with a sharp squeal. Her breath was shallow, but her tone burst out fast and loud, threaded with righteous fury. Enough, she barked, grabbing hold of the microphone. This has gone too far. Her voice trembled just enough to blur the line between anger and panic, but not enough to hide the truth. She had not expected Jasmine to bring this much fire and this much evidence. You're dragging my family into this? She said, louder now, her voice filling the chamber. My husband isn't here. He's not part of this hearing. He doesn't have a seat at this table to defend himself. She swept her hand in front of her as if to shield an invisible man beside her. You're attacking a private citizen. You're attacking my marriage, just because you can't defend your own policies. Her words spilled over each other like bricks thrown in panic. It wasn't calculated anymore. It was raw. Caroline wasn't testifying now. She was retreating, and everyone in the room could feel it. Some members of the committee leaned back, uncertain whether to intervene. A few glanced toward the chairman. Aides paused mid-note, waiting. Reporters stopped typing for once, watching the shift unfold in real time. It was a classic political move. When facts close in, reframe the fight as personal. Make yourself the victim. Turn the weaponized lie into an emotional shield. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even move. She simply waited, calm, still, unreadable. And then when the silence was just long enough to sting, she spoke, soft, steady, and sharp as truth carved in stone. No one, Jasmine said, her voice so level it felt like a gavel, is attacking your husband. The words cut through the air like a needle through silk. Her tone was not emotional, not defensive. It was clean, deliberate, unflinching. This, she said, gesturing gently to the folder on the desk, is not about your marriage, not about your love, not about your private life. This is about financial ties to public consequences. She took a slow step forward. It's not personal, Miss Levitt. It's structural, systemic, intentional. Caroline's face twitched, but she said nothing. The room was watching now, truly watching, not for drama, but for clarity, for the line between accusation and revelation. Your husband may not be in this room, Jasmine continued, but the company he invested in is. The technology he helped fund is. The weapon they created and deployed is sitting in our faces on this screen. She pointed once more toward the frozen frame behind her, still showing the metadata, the timestamp, the company name. He doesn't have to be here to defend himself, because this isn't a story about feelings. This is a story about capital, about control. Her voice deepened, each word slower now, like a drum beat counting down to a truth no one wanted to face. He put money into a system that creates synthetic lies. And those lies were designed, not by accident, but with full intention, to discredit women who look like me, to mislead voters who believe in people like me, to hijack trust in voices like mine. She walked toward the table again and placed her palm flat on the folder. She wasn't angry. She was anchored. Every movement intentional, every syllable weighted. This isn't about your husband's reputation, she said, looking Caroline directly in the eye. It's about the effect of his investments, about how power, real power, moves in silence, behind firewalls and spreadsheets. You want to talk about defense? Then let's talk about the people who can't defend themselves, because they believed what your husband's company helped create. Let's talk about the voters who were lied to, manipulated, and weaponized without ever knowing it. She paused, not for effect, but because the next line needed space around it. "You think your family's being attacked?" Jasmine said quietly. "Number your family helped build the attack." Gas moved through the room, not loud, not chaotic, just small, sudden exhalations from people who realized, all at once, that they just watched the temperature of truth shift again. Caroline stood frozen, her hands clenched at her sides. The redness in her cheeks was no longer performance. It was collapse. Jasmine stepped back from the mic, folded her hands, and let the stillness speak for itself. She didn't need applause. She didn't need volume, because her voice had done what machines could not: cut through lies without losing humanity. And around her, the silence was not absence. It was reckoning. The room was no longer a hearing chamber. It had transformed, slowly, deliberately, into something else, something colder, something more intimate. No one spoke. No one shuffled papers. The overhead lights hummed faintly, but even that seemed to recede into silence. Jasmine Crockett stood perfectly still at the center of it all, not moving, not blinking, her hands resting calmly by her sides as if she were standing not in defense, but in judgment. Every slide had been shown, every receipt laid bare. The video, the metadata, the internal memo, the target demographics, the financial ties, the investment records. And yet, for all the data and all the exposure, there was still one thing missing: the human cost, the betrayal that couldn't be illustrated by heat maps or timetables. And that was what Jasmine was holding now, not in her hands, but in her stillness, in her restraint, in her refusal to perform. She didn't need theatrics. The truth was already afire at their feet, and Caroline Levitt, across from her, was standing far too close to the spark. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean into the microphone. She simply looked calmly, steadily, straight at Caroline. She waited long enough to let the silence stretch tight across the chamber like piano wire. Long enough for the weight of what had already been shown to settle into the eyes of everyone watching, in the room and on the live feeds. Then, with the kind of clarity that only comes when every mask has already fallen, Jasmine spoke. "If you believe in truth," she said, "then why did you invest in the technology built to fake it?" There was no anger in her voice, no tremble. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even a challenge. It was a question. Plain, devastating, final. It came not from rage, but from control, from the deepest form of power: certainty. And in that moment, it did what nothing else could. It erased the line between political theater and real accountability. Caroline froze. She didn't respond. She couldn't. The words landed like a cold hand pressed to the back of her neck. Unexpected, undeniable. Her mouth twitched as if trying to form something. A deflection, a justification, anything. But nothing came. The room was watching her now. Not Jasmine, not the screen. Her. The walls of protection she had built around herself. The data, the talking points, the carefully rehearsed indignation collapsed in an instant, because this wasn't an attack. It was a mirror. Her breath hitched. She bit her lower lip. Just slightly. Just enough. It was subtle. A flicker, a hairline crack in the marble facade of certainty. Her chin lowered a fraction. Her eyes, once so defiant, dropped not all the way, but enough. Enough for the cameras to catch it, for the silence to record it like evidence. The CNN operator, positioned off-center near the press balcony, saw it. He didn't wait for a cue. He zoomed in slowly, deliberately, past the edge of the table, past the curve of Caroline's shoulder, past the perfectly placed mic. His frame settled, clean and merciless, on the rectangular white placard in front of her. Caroline Levitt, U.S. Press Secretary. No commentary, no voiceover, just the title. And that title, in that moment, said more than she could. Because it wasn't just a name. It wasn't just a role. It was a contradiction. She had sat there all morning, insisting on the power of her office, of protecting the public, of defending democracy, of transparency. She had called the technology noble, necessary, precise. She had praised its ability to cut through lies. She had said it was built to guard the truth. And yet here it was, turned inward, against her, as the very machine she defended was exposed as the very weapon used to lie. The silence didn't just linger, it tightened. You could feel the eyes in the room shift again, but this time not in shock or awe. This time in understanding. Senators exchanged glances, not out of confusion, but recognition. The pieces were no longer scattered. They had been laid in order, in sequence, and now they locked together with the force of inevitability. Because Jasmine hadn't come here to argue, she had come to expose. And the final exposure was not in the files or slides, but in that one unanswered question. If you believe in truth, why did you invest in the technology built to fake it? There was no place to hide from it. The question was too elegant to refute, too direct to escape. It didn't attack Caroline's character. It exposed her choices. It didn't accuse her of creating the lie. It reminded everyone she paid for the machine that made it, that she wasn't a victim. She wasn't a bystander. She was part of the chain. And Jasmine never looked away. She didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. She didn't add another word. Because she didn't need to. The room was holding its breath. Even the press had stopped typing. Their pens had gone still. The only sound was the faint, constant hum of the monitors. And somewhere in the distance, the mechanical click of a still photographer taking one shot, then another. Caroline's face was still pale. She tried to shift in her seat, but even that small movement felt weighted, like she knew too many eyes were watching, like she understood the cost of trying to escape a question that had already settled like ash on her nameplate. Her silence was not power. It was collapse. And in the absence of her answer, something louder was heard. The truth, spoken in full, without permission, without apology. Jasmine Crockett remained standing, still as stone, quiet as consequence. And in that quiet, history adjusted its weight. And then, without a gavel, without a word from Jasmine or Caroline, the chairman of the committee finally broke the silence. He leaned forward, slowly, heavily, as if the sheer weight of what had just unfolded had settled on his back like 100 bricks. The microphone in front of him crackled to life. At this time, he said, his voice strained, dry, shaken in a way no one had heard before, this committee will enter an immediate recess, pending verification of all evidence presented. He looked around the room, not for consensus, but for stability. None met his gaze, not yet. Because the hearing had stopped being a hearing, it had become a battlefield of revelations, a courtroom without a judge, a broadcast with no script left. The moment the chairman spoke those words, immediate recess, the energy in the room snapped like an electrical circuit suddenly rerouted. The air was no longer heavy, it was frantic. Movement erupted. Reporters, who had been frozen in stunned silence just minutes earlier, shot to their feet like alarms had gone off. Phones were already in their hands before their chairs finished scraping backward. Heads down, mouths open, they began speaking over each other in hurried staccato bursts, whispering names, dates, commands. This is going live, now. Get me the file, all of it. Send this upstairs, no edits. Producers ran toward the exits, speaking into earpieces. Field reporters whispered into phones, walking fast but still keeping one eye on the dais in case anything else exploded. You could hear network names ricochet through the air like bullets. CNN, NBC, REUTERS, MSNBC, even Fox. No one was willing to look away, not after that. Jasmine still hadn't moved. She remained standing, hands gently folded, calm in the middle of chaos she didn't create, but revealed. Her screen was dark now, her slides gone, but her impact was everywhere. There were no more attempts to rebut her, no more questions thrown her way. She had become, in a single unspoken turn, unquestionable, not just because of the documents, not just because of the metadata, but because she never flinched. And in a world where perception ruled, that alone was power. And then the digital world responded. In a production trailer parked 4 blocks away, the CNN social media director shouted from behind his monitor. Her follower count just jumped 78,000 in under 10 minutes. On a separate screen, the live comment feed was spinning faster than the interns could read. Phrases repeated in all caps. Jasmine just ended her. This is history. I'm switching parties. By the hour's end, Jasmine's X account, the one that had been targeted by smear campaigns and buried in manipulated search results, had gained over 400,000 new followers. Verified, organic, no ads, no bots, just impact. Real, live Americans, watching, stunned, rewiring their faith in real time. Inside the chamber, Caroline had sat back down, but not like before. She no longer filled her chair. She occupied it, quiet, smaller. Aides surrounded her, whispering, shielding her with bodies but not with credibility. No one looked at her the same way. The woman who had walked into that room with the confidence of someone bulletproof now sat like someone who'd heard the click too late. Meanwhile, producers inside MSNBC's New York studio moved with military precision. One barked, "Clip the question, just the question." Another added, "Overlay it with the shot of Caroline's face." No reaction commentary. Let it speak for itself. The edit took 2 minutes. The post took 2 seconds. Within 5 minutes, the 13-second clip of Jasmine's calm, surgical question, "If you believe in truth, why did you invest in the technology built to fake it?" had been viewed over 2 million times, and it was only growing. Outside the Capitol, crowds were already forming. Tourists stopped walking. Protesters turned their signs toward the building. Some wore headphones, watching the feed on their phones. Others stared at their screens in complete silence. One woman mouthed Jasmine's final words as if praying them. The power of the moment had left the room. It had cracked through glass and pixel. It had escaped into the bloodstream of the nation. But back inside the high-ceiling chamber, still half-frozen in disbelief, the aftermath of the hearing suspension played out like the slow pull of a curtain. Staffers moved quickly, collecting papers, but eyes kept darting to Jasmine, as if afraid that at any moment she might drop another bomb or vanish like a ghost that only appears when history needs reminding. But Jasmine did neither. She simply gathered her folder, the same black folder that had just flipped the balance of an entire investigation, and closed it quietly. It wasn't over, but something had ended. Not the hearing, not the investigation, but the illusion. The illusion that power could hide behind distance, that lies built on code could not be traced, that you could aim at a voice like Jasmine's and expect silence in return. And no one understood that better than the people scrambling now. Media, staffers, analysts, operatives, racing to figure out what they had just witnessed and what they would tell the world it meant. But for the people watching, not the politicians, not the strategists, not the talking heads, but the citizens sitting at home, eyes locked on a screen, mouths half open, something simpler had taken root. They saw a woman stand up with nothing but a folder and a flash drive and unravel the myth that truth was helpless. And when the chairman finally stood again, his voice once more taking control of the room, it was with no pomp, no ceremony, just gravity. "This committee will reconvene," he said, "once we've reviewed and authenticated all submitted evidence. Until then, this hearing stands in recess." He didn't need to say more. Everyone in the room, and every viewer across the country, already understood. The truth had spoken, and no matter how many algorithms had tried to erase it, it was still here, still breathing, still undeniable. And as the cameras finally dimmed inside the hearing room and the heavy doors closed behind the last stunned witness, the ripple effect began, not in whispers, but in numbers. Far from Capitol Hill, in glass towers filled with glowing monitors and trading screens, the storm hit faster than most realized. CentralLogic's stock, once the darling of the tech elite, once praised as the future of political security and behavioral analytics, opened at $92.17 per share. By noon, it was $81.06. By 2 p.m., it was in freefall. 17%. Gone. Billions evaporated with the speed of a mouse click. Analysts on Bloomberg scrambled to find explanations mid-broadcast. Some tried to downplay it. Market overreaction, they said. Others were more candid. This isn't a sell-off, it's a reckoning. Investors panicked. Automated trading systems triggered in cascades. Shareholders demanded emergency board meetings. Screens across the financial sector turned red, like a blood pressure monitor exploding under stress. There was no virus, no global collapse, no war. Just one hearing. Just one woman. Just one truth the market wasn't ready for. Inside the nerve centers of central logic itself, the tension turned to chaos. Internal Slack channels were shut down. Company-wide meetings were pulled onto encrypted servers. Staff whispered the word testimony like a curse. Legal teams huddled in corners. Public relations scrambled to craft statements that could soften the blow. But the damage had already bled into the walls. Every employee now knew what the outside world was watching. Their brand wasn't just bleeding, it was radioactive. No one could say it out loud, but they all felt it. The company had built its reputation on trust, and Jasmine Crockett had just shattered that foundation with 6 words. Why invest in the technology to fake truth? While the market reeled, the media did what it does best: fracture. 2 realities emerged from the same footage. Fox News launched into counterattack before the hearing had even been gavelled out. Primetime anchors with polished suits and strained smiles dismissed the documents as unverified leaks, calling the deepfake evidence interesting but inconclusive. They painted Jasmine as theatrical, a gifted performer, they said, but light on substance. Tucker Carlson's substitute host ran a full segment titled, "The Left's Deepfake Drama, Another Desperate Smear." They questioned her motives. They questioned her timing. They showed slow-motion clips of her final statement, stripping it of tone and context, turning her poised composure into something cold, almost robotic. "If you remove the emotion," one commentator said, "you'll see she never actually proved that Levitt ordered the video. This was all circumstantial." Another guest chimed in, "She went after a husband, a private citizen. That tells you everything." But outside the Fox bubble, the story unfolded very differently. On MSNBC, banners read like headlines from a film script. The first political AI reckoning in American history. Crockett versus the machine. Deepfake collapse when truth fights back. Rachel Maddow opened her segment without preamble. "Tonight, we witnessed not just the unraveling of a political scandal, we witnessed a turning point in the story of democracy itself." She replayed the clip of Jasmine's question in full. No commentary, no interruption. Then let the screen fade to black for 3 full seconds of silence. "That," she said, "was the sound of a lie dying." Editorials erupted across digital outlets. The Atlantic ran a headline that read, "The day tech blinked first." Rolling Stone, "Central logic burned, but Jasmine Crockett lit the match." TechCrunch, "AI has a morality problem. Today it faced its first real trial." The story flooded every timeline, every homepage, and through it all, Jasmine said nothing. She posted no victory. She gave no interview. She disappeared into silence, and her silence spoke louder than any spin. Yet despite the headlines and hashtags, Jasmine wasn't celebrating, because she knew what others were only beginning to realize: that exposing a system doesn't end it. The fall of a stock doesn't dismantle the architecture behind it. And the media, even when it applauds you, will move on. But the damage done to trust, to community, to her identity, that would linger. The people who had believed the fake video still existed. The people who had threatened her inbox, her staff, her family, they didn't just vanish. For every viewer who saw the truth, there were 5 who saw a gotcha clip stripped of context and twisted into another culture war. That was the part no headline could fix. She had stood up, exposed a machine designed to erase her, and forced the world to see it. But justice was slow, painfully slow. And truth, no matter how sharp, rarely traveled as fast as lies crafted by code. So when the anchors praised her, she stayed quiet. When the markets crashed, she didn't smile. And when the world trended her name, she didn't post a word. Because she understood what so many did not. This wasn't her moment to win. It was the system's moment to be seen losing. And that was just the beginning. And just as the headlines cooled and the hashtags began to fade, the second wave arrived, not in the form of trending clips or cable news debate, but in the unblinking language of subpoenas and sealed memos. The U.S. Department of Justice issued a brief but devastating press release at 7:03 a.m. the following Monday. A federal inquiry has been opened into the financial ties between CentralLogic and various current and former government officials. The scope includes undisclosed investments, procurement contracts, and political communications related to synthetic media technologies. 17 words, no names, no party lines. But the message underneath was clear. The machine was no longer invisible. By 9 a.m., white vans with blacked-out windows were seen pulling into the Northern Virginia headquarters of CentralLogic. At the same time, two mid-level aides at the Office of Digital Security were placed on administrative leave. By noon, three congressional staffers retained legal counsel, and within 24 hours, the term AI laundering began trending, referring to the funneling of taxpayer-funded research grants through semi-private AI firms, some of which were found to share board members with political appointees. For the first time in years, the words conflict of interest didn't feel theoretical. They felt like ash. What Jasmine had cracked open wasn't just about a faked video. It was about something much older, much darker, the way power hides itself behind innovation, and the way innovation, unchecked, becomes a tool of engineered deceit. She had testified with a folder and a question. Now federal agents were comparing internal communications, mapping out shell corporations, and connecting campaign donations to defense tech trials. And still, Jasmine had said nothing more. Until now. The studio lights in D.C. were lower than usual, softened for the tone of the interview. The anchor across from her had covered wars, elections, and 2 impeachments. But even she looked hesitant when she asked the final question. Congresswoman Crockett, after all of this, after the evidence, the hearing, the investigations, what lessons should the American people take from what you uncovered? Jasmine didn't answer immediately. She sat still, her hands clasped lightly in front of her, her posture strong but not rigid. Her face wasn't triumphant. It wasn't even proud. It was solemn, tired, focused. And then she spoke. We can forgive mistakes, she said quietly. We've all made them. I've made them. The public has a remarkable capacity to forgive when there's accountability. But what we cannot forgive, what we should never normalize, is the industrialization of deception, the mass production of lies, the cloning of falsehoods through technology built not to protect people, but to manipulate them. She looked up, straight into the camera. What we're dealing with now is not just fake news, it's fake people, fake voices, fake realities, sold to us with clean logos and buzzwords, funded by billion-dollar firms with government contracts and patriotic slogans. But underneath it, it's poison, digitized, sanitized, weaponized. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. We can forgive human error, Jasmine continued, her tone sharpening like a blade. But we cannot forgive the manufacturing of lies, on purpose, for profit, dressed up as progress. The anchor didn't speak. The control room didn't cut away. The silence after her words felt heavier than applause, because everyone watching knew what she was saying. This wasn't a scandal. It was a warning, and it had come too close to being missed. Meanwhile, across social platforms, her quote appeared within minutes. Not as a meme, not as a clip, but as a sentence. Clean, chilling, unshakable. We can forgive mistakes, but we cannot forgive the mass production of lies by design. It trended not because it was catchy, but because it was true, and no one knew how to unhear it. And though the networks had already clipped her words, though the sentence had begun to echo through feeds and headlines, we can forgive mistakes, but we cannot forgive the mass production of lies by design. Jasmine Crockett herself did not celebrate. She did not post. She did not respond. Because she understood what the moment demanded was not noise, it was reflection. She left the studio quietly that night, no entourage, no victory lap. Just her and the silence that always follows after you've spoken something that can't be taken back. The kind of silence that follows only after you've said something so clear, so exact, that it stops even the liars in their tracks. The kind of silence that feels like standing in the eye of a storm, and realizing the storm is made of people. And as the sun set over Washington and the Potomac darkened beneath the amber streetlights, Jasmine walked alone, coat wrapped tight, the city behind her flashing with all the images she no longer controlled. Her face, her voice, her question, her truth. All of it now bouncing around satellites and screens, dissected by strangers, defended by some, distorted by others. But none of that was the lesson. That would come later. That would come in the quiet. Because what no camera ever captured, what no breaking news graphic ever printed, was the cost of being right. The loneliness, the exhaustion, the unspoken knowledge that even when the system breaks in front of you, it doesn't collapse. It adapts. It survives. It shifts the floor beneath your feet and waits for you to slip. And Jasmine had felt that long before she stood in that hearing room. She had known it in law school when she spoke up and watched professors raise their eyebrows just slightly higher than when her white classmates spoke. She had known it on the campaign trail when she was told not to sound too angry, even while defending people who had lost their homes, their health care, their parents. She had known it when the deepfake first surfaced, before the forensic reports, before the watermark, when people she knew personally shared the clip without question. She had always known that being right doesn't protect you. It paints a target on your back. That was the first lesson. Truth is not a shield. It is a flare. You light it, and everything that feeds on darkness sees you. And still, Jasmine lit it. Not because she believed the system would thank her for it, but because if she didn't, she would have to live with the rot, with the silence, with the knowledge that a tool built to erase her identity, her record, her voice, had nearly succeeded. So when the investigation began, when subpoenas were issued, when committee chairs scrambled to revise talking points, when tech executives deleted tweets and braced for legal fallout, Jasmine remained still, not because she felt satisfied, but because she knew how short the memory of justice could be. She had no illusions. There would be more hearings, more manufactured clips, more software dressed in patriotism and sold as security. Someone somewhere was already building the next version of the lie. Faster, smarter, harder to detect. So the lesson couldn't just be legal, it had to be human. And when a young journalist asked her a week later, off camera, off the record, what she had learned, she didn't reach for policy or rhetoric. She said something no one expected. People don't need to be protected from lies, she said. They need to be reminded that they still matter in a world trying to digitize their doubt. Because that's what the deep fake didn't just try to do to her. It tried to reduce her to a version, a clip, a mouth saying things she never said, a headline stripped of history, a figure that could be copy-pasted, clipped, distorted. That's what they were trying to do to everyone. Not just lie about people, but replace them. That was the second lesson. This wasn't about erasing her. It was about erasing authenticity, replacing the imperfect, the human, the layered and complicated truth of real people with programmed illusions that could be controlled. Clean, predictable, disposable, and that's what made her decision to speak up, as herself, so dangerous. Because in a system built to erase nuance, being unapologetically real is revolutionary. She didn't cry on the stand. She didn't yell. She didn't crack. She refused to be distorted. She forced the world to deal with her as she is. And that resistance, quiet, powerful, unblinking, became something larger than the scandal. It became a mirror that revealed just how many people had accepted the fake because it was easier than facing the uncomfortable, defiant truth of someone who refused to break. That was the third lesson. People don't want lies, they want certainty. And if the lie feels more certain than the truth, they'll choose it every time. Jasmine's strength was not in her argument. It was in her refusal to offer comfort. She didn't make it easy. She didn't offer an escape hatch. She made the nation sit in its discomfort. And in doing so, she made people feel again. Feel distrust. Feel violated. Feel responsible. Because what good is exposing a lie if people walk away thinking it was someone else's problem? So she didn't let them. In her interviews, she didn't shift blame. She didn't speak in third person. She didn't distance herself from the fear. She named it. She stood next to it. She said, "This was done to me." But it could have been you, your mother, your daughter, your voice, your truth. She made the danger personal, and because of that, the truth became personal too. That was the final lesson. We don't fight to be heard because we believe we'll win. We fight to remind others that they're not alone, that their silence is not inevitable, that someone already broke the wall, and they can walk through it. And Jasmine Crockett, standing beneath the weight of a system that tried to digitize her out of existence, had done exactly that. She didn't fix the machine, but she cracked it. She didn't stop the technology, but she stopped its invisibility. And in a world where injustice thrives on invisibility, that was everything. That was human. That was the lesson. And while the moral wound still pulsed through the nation's conscience like a fresh scar, Jasmine knew one thing more dangerous than the lie that nearly erased her: silence in its aftermath. The investigation had begun. The headlines had flared and cooled. The public was watching, but watching wasn't enough, because lies don't die on exposure. They evolve in neglect. And Jasmine had seen enough, survived enough, to know that the story couldn't end with her vindication. It had to begin with collective awakening. So she returned one last time, not to testify, but to ignite. The Capitol hearing room looked different now. Cameras had multiplied. Reporters leaned forward, not with smug detachment, but with something new: unease. A sense that history was not behind them, but waiting just ahead, knife in hand. Jasmine stood not behind a desk, but before it. Not as a witness, not as a victim, but as a warning. She didn't bring a USB stick. She brought the truth. And this time, she didn't whisper it. She didn't thread it gently between metaphors. She brought it raw. "I came here today not because I was invited," she said, "but because the lie came for me. And now it's coming for all of you." The room stilled. "Some of you think this ends with an indictment," she continued. "That exposure alone is justice. But I need you to understand something. This technology, this silent machine of manipulation, it doesn't care who you vote for. It doesn't care what God you pray to. It doesn't even care about truth. It only cares about what people believe. And belief, my friends, has become programmable." A ripple of discomfort moved through the room. Jasmine didn't pause. "They used it on me because I was loud, because I was inconvenient, because I was a black woman who didn't fold when told to behave. But don't think that makes me the only target. Don't think for a second you are safe just because today the spotlight isn't on you." Her hand lifted, firm and open. "Tomorrow it will be your words they fake. Your daughter's face on a video she never made. Your father's voice saying something he never said." She stepped forward. "And when that happens, you won't need a hero." She pointed, calm, surgical. "You'll need each other." Silence. And then her voice dropped low, not quiet, deadly. "This is not about regulation. This is about resistance. This is about a public that no longer accepts digital warfare as background noise. This is about a nation that doesn't outsource its reality to machines." She looked into every lens. If they can fabricate truth, then truth becomes our responsibility, not mine. Not just the journalists, but yours. Her breath caught, not in weakness, but in conviction. Fact check what you share. Question what you watch. Demand transparency from every official, every company, every voice with power. She leaned in, not toward the mic, but toward the moment. This is your call to action, not as Democrats, not as Republicans, but as witnesses to what just happened, as citizens who now know what can be done in your name, with your data, and against your will. Her final words didn't come as a crescendo. They came like a verdict. "No one will save democracy for us. We either protect it together or we watch it be rewritten, one synthetic lie at a time." And then she stepped back. The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to, because silence, when pregnant with truth, thunders louder than applause. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.